Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. I am Heather Thompson, Director of Internet Marketing for Medmarc. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, thank you for joining us. I'm so pleased to kick off today's presentation titled Ripped from the Headlines, Medmarc's Risk Management Team discusses today's life sciences news stories. Klaus and Courtney Young, two attorneys in Medmarc's Risk Management Department, are going to break down some of the biggest headlines. Klaus, author of Life Sciences Guidebook, An Introduction to FDA Regulation and a Framework for Successful Navigation, focuses on legal matters faced by participants in the life sciences industry, specifically FDA regulatory compliance. She brings her prior experience in navigating the FDA landscape to Medmarc, where she works with colleagues in-house as well as with policyholders in developing and strengthening regulatory compliance strategies in an effort to mitigate product liability losses. Ms. Klaus is a graduate of Catholic University of America, Columbus School of Law, and the College of the Holy Cross. Courtney Young, in addition to speaking engagements and publishing articles on product liability risk management for the life sciences industry, brings to Medmarc the development of resources on product liability avoidance and regular correspondence with brokers, policyholders, and underwriters in efforts to evaluate and mitigate product liability risk. Ms. Young is a graduate from the George Mason University School of Law and the University of California, Santa Barbara. With that, I am pleased to turn it over to Courtney, who will begin today's presentation.
Thanks, Heather. Okay, so Kate and I will do our best to break down the biggest news stories affecting life sciences companies. So a few of the things that we're going to look at today, we'll start with kind of some new developments in life sciences and specifically how insurance markets are responding to them. So both, in language and in appetite, we'll kind of break those down. Kate will talk to you about the next FDA Commissioner, some possibilities there. I'll briefly touch on the intersection of product liability and healthcare and sort of check in on any developments are there, because we've seen a lot of headlines sort of around that area, and it brings into question whether the liability laws will be evolving. Kate will take a look at medical device cybersecurity, and then we will enter our lightning round, always a favorite, probably just of Kate and myself, but hopefully for you too. And we'll talk about different life sciences stories and sort of break them down at lightning speed. So I will kick it off and talk about product liability and healthcare. So we've just been seeing a lot of different things in the headlines related to the activities of hospitals and healthcare providers. So I just did a real sampling here, and the question sort of becomes whether these changes affect liability law. So let's back up a little bit. There is a legal concept called strict liability, and it applies to product sellers, well, really everyone in that chain of the supply chain delivering consumer products. So it holds that if injury results from the use of a product, the seller will be held, with some limited exceptions, strictly liable for that injury. So over the years, there have been some attempts to argue that hospitals should also face this strict liability principle, as really they're selling medical devices and supplies to patients. So courts have heard this in several different states and consistently rejected these arguments, holding that public policy doesn't support such an application, and that hospitals are really service providers, and the production or the supply of products, rather, are merely incidental to that provision of service. So this was actually articulated in the Restatement of Torts, which is usually kind of a summation of the current law, or it's supposed to be anyway, in the country. That's what I've got pictured at the right here. So then again, given these recent headlines and these emerging roles hospitals are taking, does this rejection of strict liability make sense? So is hospital liability evolving? I'd say probably not yet. So like I said, the activities of hospitals are changing a lot. The advent of 3D printing adds some confusion as to whether or not the hospital is providing products merely as incidental to its provision of service, as the service, in the case of 3D printing, can really be seen as the provision of the product. But we have to remember that most 3D printing at the point of care can't really be considered manufacturing either, right? As they're, manufactured, so to speak, one at a time, particular to the patient. So this is sort of moot on the question of the application of strict liability. But as hospitals are greater participants in the development of products, and in some cases even retaining the IP to the products developed and profiting from their sale, maybe a stronger argument can be made there with respect to exploring the application of products liability to hospitals. So another strain of thought that has been that hospitals are frequently profiting from touting particular devices and particular products they sell. I'd say the Da Vinci robot really comes to mind. You kind of see hospitals advertising their use of the Da Vinci robot by specific brand name. So here they're kind of seeking to lure patients because of the use of the device. Now, with respect to the Da Vinci robot, again, that doesn't quite bring them into the role of product seller either, because of course the robot's retained by the hospital and not sold at all. But it still might portend some evolution if hospitals start advertising the particular types of implants, for example, or types of supplies used. Then they really start to begin to look more like sellers, and it becomes harder to argue, on public policy grounds that maybe the application of products liability isn't appropriate anymore. So I'd say, despite their recent activities in the news, the liability laws and the protections for hospitals haven't changed yet, but I think it's something for us to keep an eye on as their roles and their activities evolve and they become to look more like product sellers. So we'll probably check back in on that, in the next webinar we do for you, but that's the status as of now. And with that, I will turn things over to Kate, who will talk about the next FDA Commissioner.
Courtney, the FDA is currently without a commissioner that has been approved by the Senate. The previous FDA commissioner was Scott Gottlieb. He resigned this past April after leading the agency for about 2 years. He was a fairly polarizing figure at the time that he was nominated to the position, given his ties to the industry. He had a long history with FDA, but after leaving the agency, he worked as a lobbyist for a period of time. And that tie to the industry, that tie to lobbying was really held against him during his confirmation process. The agenda that he adopted, however, was really pretty popular. There was a significant improvement in drug approval times under his leadership, and there was also a fairly significant crackdown on tobacco and vaping, which was a bit of a change for the agency. Even though they've had oversight of tobacco for a number of years, the tobacco lobby has really hindered any ability that FDA has had to study the health implications and attempt to reduce use of tobacco in the United States. After Dr. Gottlieb resigned, the acting commissioner, Ned Sharpless, was named, and he assumed office on the day that Dr. Gottlieb resigned, April 5th. He has really held the course in maintaining the Gottlieb agenda. He stated that was his intention, and he really has followed through on that course of action. He is an oncologist by training, and he was formerly the head of the National Cancer Institute. He is seen as a contender for the appointment or nomination as FDA Commissioner. He has been endorsed by multiple former FDA commissioners as well as most of the medical and healthcare industries. He is not necessarily the front runner, however. Dr. Stephen Hahn, he is a radiation oncologist and chief medical executive at MD Anderson in Texas. And he met with the White House in early October, and at that time was really considered the front runner for the nomination as commissioner. He is said to be the top choice of the administration, and particularly the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar. It's really unclear at this point what his leadership priorities would be. MD Anderson has not commented on a potential nomination for him, but it's not unreasonable to expect that as a practicing physician, he would be interested in a continued focus on drug approval times and getting new technology to patients with very critical conditions. There is a deadline for the White House to name a new nominee. The Federal Vacancies Reform Act permits acting agency heads to stay in place for a total of 210 days. The deadline for them to name a nominee is November 1st. There are a lot of other things that are consuming attention at the White House these days, but with this deadline in place, we should be getting some news about an official nomination soon. They should be able to wrap up the vetting process on Stephen Hahn, given that they started almost a month ago. And depending upon who is actually named as the nominee, I think the confirmation process should be relatively smooth. Regardless, they're both fairly well respected. And I think the likelihood that the agenda will stay fairly consistent is pretty high. And with that, I am going to turn it back over to you, Courtney, for our next topic.
Like I said, we'll talk about some developments in the life sciences, and we'll start off with opioids. So I know we've seen a lot of these. These have been in the headlines for several years now, but really most recently we've seen these massive settlements in anticipation of trial, and that's really put them back in the headlines in the last couple of days. So I don't actually want to talk too much about what's going on there, or the MDL. I think that's all over the news. I'm going to talk about how insurance markets are responding to this, and specifically talk about opioids in the context of coverage. So how are insurance markets responding? So, these suits have obviously been coming in over the past few years, so insurers have had time to kind of advance their arguments, and they've been sort of tested in the waters here. With GL policies, they typically have an exclusion for products completed operations, and they have been successful in denying claims from opioid manufacturers and distributor insurers on the basis that these are their completed operations. So under their products liability policies, their products completed operations policies, insurers have tried with various degrees of success to deny liability for some of these, particularly these kind of blight nuisance claims that states and cities are bringing, trying to recoup healthcare costs that are spent on victims of opioid addictions. So first, they've claimed that this is not because of bodily injury, strictly speaking. Some of this has actually come down to whether the coverage grant states that it covers claims arising out of bodily injury, because of bodily injury, or for bodily injury, with for bodily injury actually being the narrowest construction, and insurers have had some success saying that, especially these claims that are to recoup healthcare costs, it isn't really for bodily injury, and it's not, what the policy was intended. Another strain of arguments relates to whether this epidemic is in fact an occurrence. This has been almost universally unsuccessful, although there has been one case in California, the Travelers Company of America versus activists in 2017, and the court did agree that this was not an unforeseeable accident, which was part of the policy's definition of an occurrence. So that might suggest that this court, or a court applying similar reasoning, might find also that the expected intended exclusion would bar coverage. And so I haven't seen insurers relying too heavily on that, but I wouldn't be surprised. It certainly doesn't mean that they're not among their other policy arguments. So that's sort of what they were doing with their policies as is. But now how are they responding to try to stem these claims and make it really clear that they don't intend to cover these opioid losses? Obviously, you're seeing the size of these settlements. These are going to be limit losses in most cases. So carriers are really trying to ensure that they're not going to be liable for these. So we've seen an evolution in insurers' approach to these products. And as exclusions have evolved, so too has the plaintiff's bar's methodology in trying to get coverage. So they are very smart and mindful of the fact that they are more likely to get a large recovery if they can get access to the defendant's insurance policies. So they draft complaints specifically to invoke the defendant's insurance coverage and increase their chances of large recoveries. So sort of an example of this, when insurers started excluding suits brought by government entities, because we were seeing so many suits brought by counties and states, so that was thought to be one way to kind of bar these kind of suits, were to say, we maybe either define suit as not including suits by government entities or put a flat-out exclusion of suits brought by government entities. So then the plaintiffs' bar started joining in the suit these private entities like insurance companies or hospitals, so they defeat that coverage bar. So we know that the insurance law in most states is that they've got to defend if any part of the complaint includes a covered allegation. So a suit is one of these parties is not a government entity, that becomes not a suit by government entity. The coverage is, or the language is construed pretty strictly against the drafter, and in this case the carrier. So plaintiff's bar has been able to defeat sort of that coverage bar. Then we saw that there'd be opioid-specific exclusions, but they'd carve out these antagonist products. They'd carve out naloxone or methadone, and sure enough, we started seeing complaints that included these products grouped in with the other opioids to kind of get out of that exclusion. Again, the carriers must defend if any part of the allegations contained in the complaint are covered, and the plaintiff's bar is aware of this in crafting these complaints. So this combination has led insurance carriers to impose these really broad, absolute opioid exclusions. So I'd say sort of the bottom line here is coverage is becoming almost impossible to find, and you're paying almost, dollar for dollar of it. Companies have been able to find some coverage going abroad, and they've been able to utilize sort of some creative arrangements. Maybe there's a sublimit on these losses, or a separate very high deductible. But I think companies are going to find that just the cost of insurance is going to make the sales that they're reaping from this, particularly if it's a small portion of their business, it might not make it viable to continue to sell these products. So that'll be sort of a crisis that the country will probably have to confront in the not too distant future. But I'd say some takeaways for life sciences companies given this, and I'm talking now with respect to life sciences companies that don't sell opioids or don't sell opioids exclusively, you'll really want to assess these and have your broker really scrutinize these exclusions. And I think there's a particular concern with respect to companies selling maybe drug delivery systems. You do not want all claims involving opioids excluded because, of course, your product, although an opioid may have been involved, your product is not an opioid. So one thing to make sure is that these exclusions are excluding only claims arising out of opioids when your product is an opioid, and so not all claims that have an opioid involved in them are then a bar to your coverage, and you're not able to access your limits because of an overly broad exclusion that's not exactly intended for your product. So work with your broker and your carrier to make sure that that's not happening inadvertently. I think carriers are trying to protect themselves and painting a pretty broad brush with respect to these products. So looking next at cannabis products. So again, we've seen a lot of news here. Of course, this has been the subject of a lot of legal developments. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how insurers are responding to these, if at all. So let's just start with kind of looking at the size of this market because, of course, that's what insurers are looking at, right, and whether it's appealing or not to insure these products. So globally, we're now at 50 countries that have legalized cannabis in some way. The projections of sales really vary, but there's been some consensus around the number provided by New Frontier data, which puts sales of consumer spending, puts the number of consumer spending at $57 billion in less than 10 years. So that's pretty sizable chunk of consumer spending. So the United States is the largest legal market, I should say. And so far we're at 34 states that have legalized medical marijuana, several more that have kind of different variations. And it looks pretty certain that retail sales will be about $13 billion this year. So obviously carriers are realizing, looking at this, that our premiums to be made here, but are proceeding with caution, as I'll talk about in a couple of slides. So I just wanted to show you this. As I talked about, this is kind of the landscape. Those states in orange are the only ones where all use is still absolutely illegal. So it's just interesting to look at this and just compare it to, what it would have been 10 years ago. It represents a real shift in public thinking and in opportunities for all these businesses that can support this industry, and insurers are certainly, a sizable one of them. So knowing that, how are insurance markets responding? So I'd say the short answer is very slowly. So to back up here, the McCarran-Ferguson Act firmly places the regulation of insurance in the state's hands. So in theory, at least, and in practice to some extent, where marijuana is legal, insurance for it could also be legal. But it's not this simple, particularly where carriers are national, where insureds do business in more than one state, and where the federal framework as it is still so uncertain. In addition to the legal uncertainty and the federal and state divide with respect to the legal status of cannabis, there's no actuarial data for carriers to rely on in pricing this business. So I think that's a big hurdle too, and that's another reason that insurers are proceeding with such caution. So that's not to say these aren't, growers and cultivators aren't being insured at all. We are definitely seeing some boutique kind of specialty carriers popping up. CannAssure is one that comes to mind, and it's pretty large, and it supports sort of all participants in this industry. I know there'll be more. I think I looked at California to date has licensed at least 5 specialty carriers that are covering hemp crops specifically, so there's definitely a lot of movement here. Let's briefly talk about sort of the language and how that interacts with these products. So I wanted to focus on some exclusions and how insurance firms are responding. So some exclusions that are just kind of baked into your standard ISO policy and how that's arguably addressing these products, and then sort of what's going on in light of the changes. So there are already some exclusions in standard CGL policies that arguably address and arguably preclude cover for cannabis products. So one of them would be the illegal acts exclusion, and another one that that takes more people by surprise, I think, is the pollution exclusion. So we've actually seen a lot of suits involving nuisance allegations that are claiming that cannabis vapors are, causing nuisance and bringing claims against cultivators and growers. And so insurers are using the pollution exclusion to say that those kind of claims are barred. And I think that that's sort of an unforeseen, at least by the insured, potentially application of that pollution exclusion, but something to be aware of. So the big news here, which happened just a couple weeks ago, is that ISO, the Insurance Services Office, recently released its first cannabis-related endorsements to the business owner policy, the BOP. So they released, I think, a total of maybe 10 endorsements. So 5 of them are straight exclusionary endorsements, 2 changed property coverage for cannabis, and 3 changed liability coverage. So I should say that historically, property loss of cannabis-related business was not covered property under the property not covered provision of that form, which excludes contraband or property in the course of illegal transportation or trade. So under federal law, obviously prior to the 2018 Farm Bill, cannabis crops were contraband and coverage was excluded under that provision. So obviously with an increasing number of states legalizing cannabis for medical or adult use and the Farm Bill legalizing hemp, ISO had to recognize that cannabis-related property may no longer constitute contraband under the BOP, and they couldn't rely on that exclusion to foreclose coverage. So that's where these new endorsements came about. I think the liability endorsements, there's 3 of them. There's one that's pretty broad, one with a hemp exception, so that keeps with the Farm Bill changes. So it's only applicable in states where it's legal, and one with a hemp exclusion exception and a lessor's risk. So this last one carves back in the BI and PD or the PAIA arising from premises that are owned, maintained, or used by the named insured but are leased to others. So I think perhaps what's most important with this ISO change is, one, that it reflects this broader change, and it's sort of a recognition that insurers need to address this and can't rely on illegal acts exclusions or property not covered provisions. And 2, that the definition of cannabis that ISO adopted, I think that'll probably be adopted by most commercial insurers. So when carriers are looking to sort of cautiously step into this industry, some products will make better test cases than others. I wanted to kind of distinguish among these types of products. It's likely that those with veterinary uses will gain the first access to your traditional large commercial carriers. And then I think, insurers are also likely to look at topicals versus ingestibles. Certainly topicals are more attractive than the edibles, ingestibles. And finally, insurers and their risk managers and underwriters will likely take a strong look at what health claims are being made by these product producers or sellers, and with those companies not making any, looking the most attractive. So I wanted to set that distinction up there. And that is, in short, what insurers are doing in response to a couple big developments in the life sciences area. I'll turn it back to Kate, who will look at cybersecurity for connected devices.
Thank you, Courtney. So cybersecurity for connected devices has been in the news a lot recently. There have been a lot of stories about software really being the weak link in medical device security. We've seen warnings issued by FDA and various manufacturers, but we've also seen fairly recently, it was the beginning of October, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum released a draft document. It's called the Principles and Practices for Medical Device Cybersecurity. This topic has really been of increasing concern due to cybersecurity events that have impacted hospitals, healthcare networks, and medical devices themselves. The international community is attempting to garner buy-in from all of the various stakeholders, various governments, industry participants, healthcare providers, all of these involved parties, because there are going to be some decisions made going forward that will impact patient safety and product safety, and there's going to need to be consensus. Things like retrofitting legacy products, developing risk management practices for connected medical devices, pre- and post-market concerns. And because all of these entities have this shared responsibility for the products, it's really critical to get them all on the same page in terms of how they will be going forward. This is really of a particular interest to us right now because of the recent warnings about the hackability of certain medical devices. Just a couple of weeks ago, FDA issued a warning about vulnerabilities for healthcare networks using certain communication software and connected medical devices. Medtronic issued a recall of some of its connected insulin pumps and issued warnings about implantable defibrillators that also had a risk of being hacked. This is not a new problem for the industry. Government, industry, and healthcare systems alike are haunted by the Wannacry attack of 2017. The Wannacry virus merely shut down users' access to their data. Notably, in the UK, the National Health Service was critically impacted by this attack. There were up to 70,000 different devices that were affected: computers, critical equipment like MRIs, blood storage refrigerators, OR equipment. All of this, it was removed from access by healthcare providers. It caused losses globally in the hundreds of millions to billions of dollar range. And it really instilled quite a lot of fear in device manufacturers and in healthcare providers that there is this potential for products to be accessed and ransom to be sought in order to regain control of them. It is a critical concern for products liability as well. We're still focused on the basic theories under which product liability suits are generally brought: warning defects, manufacturing defects, and design defects. But all of this can still come into play with regard to cyber security and cyber attacks. If we're talking about a warning defect, this is an allegation that there were insufficient warnings of hazards that were known to the manufacturer, or which the manufacturer should have known, And because the warning did not accompany the product, the user, the provider, did not receive that critical warning that the plaintiff was harmed. In a cybersecurity situation, this could be an allegation that the manufacturer failed to warn of a particular cyber vulnerability that could result in bodily injury or property damage. So, for example, with a connected insulin pump, if the manufacturer failed to warn that the device was connected or could be accessed by an unintended user, and that they could then take control of the device, and if they were to change the dosage or dump the reservoir of the drug, it could cause significant injury to the patient. Similarly, in a manufacturing setting, a manufacturing defect might be a claim that the manufacturer knew of a security issue and failed to implement the appropriate security patch. With a design defect allegation, the plaintiff would need to demonstrate that there was a reasonably safer alternative design and that the manufacturer failed to use it, chose not to use it. So the allegation might be that the manufacturer failed to design the product to adequately protect against cyber vulnerabilities, or to connect with other systems or networks or devices in a manner that would protect it from cyber attacks or cyber vulnerabilities. Any of these allegations would be a sufficient basis for a product liability claim. The fear is that another Wannacry type attack could occur and could potentially go after device functionality rather than just data. So imagine that instead of receiving, this notice that your data has been shut down, and in order to regain access, you need to pay X amount of money in Bitcoin. Instead, it could be, we have control of your pacemaker, and then if you don't pay us this money, we will stop it from functioning. Or we have control of your medication pump or any other connected device, your ventilator. All of these things that can be critical for patient survival, and if they were to malfunction or be caused to malfunction by a hacker, could cause a critical injury to a patient. So at this point, it really becomes incumbent upon the manufacturers to evaluate ways in which they can best protect against these types of attacks. They need to think about what the real viable shelf life of the product is. They need to gather data on how long the product can be maintained, can be supported before it becomes inherently unsafe, where the preferred method would be to discontinue support of the product and introduce newer models, newer versions that can keep up with developing security risks. There also needs to be sufficient preparedness in terms of policies and procedures. The manufacturers need to regularly evaluate how their products are doing. They need to screen for potential security risks. They need to know what their market competitors are doing to plan for cybersecurity. If patches are required, they need to be deployed on a timely basis and implemented appropriately. The manufacturers need to be able to ensure that this is done so that they can ensure the products they have on the market are safe for the patients. Also critical would be recall plans. does the manufacturer have a plan in place to remove products from the market if they are deemed to be unsafe? If a cybersecurity vulnerability is discovered that that could be used to implement an attack of that type, a ransomware type. And similarly, because these are they are sensational stories when these headlines happen, another plan that companies should look at and consider implementing is a crisis management plan. What is your communication strategy in the event that you have a critical issue? This can also feed into whether you are vulnerable to a warning defect allegation. Do you have sufficient communication plans in place to warn users if a problem develops that you can't fix remotely, something that they have to do in order to prevent the vulnerability from reaching the product that they have in their hands? And it comes back to your design and manufacturing defects as well. Are you creating the appropriate patches, implementing the patches appropriately? All of that can feed back into a product's liability claim if it is not handled in an adequate manner. And so in addition to all of these things that companies are going to want to consider, the paper trail that they create is also going to be critical. You want to document your thought processes. If you develop a plan, it needs to be in writing. It needs to be incorporated perhaps into your quality system. You may want to develop documents that allow you to create a paper trail as you go through these steps. Do you have the types of records that you are instructing your employees to keep? Can they be used to support or defend your position that you adequately considered the potential risks and took the necessary steps to ensure the security of your product? And with that, I believe we have reached the lightning round. So who's up first, Courtney? Is it? I am up first. So we have been getting a lot of questions lately about CBD products. There has been an explosion of interest in CBD since the 2018 Farm Bill was signed almost a year ago. But there's a little bit of a disconnect that we've seen with regard to the legality of these hemp derivatives under the 2018 Farm Bill itself. So what the 2018 Farm Bill did was remove hemp and hemp seeds from Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. It took hemp and hemp seeds out of the definition of marijuana and allowed for this type of product to be cultivated in the United States. It also allows for interstate transportation of hemp and hemp seeds. So many companies that are in sort of the cosmetic, dietary supplement, natural product space have taken this and run with it. Products have just been flooding into the market using CBD oil or hemp oil, all of these hemp derivative products. The catch here is that there have not yet been regulations written to implement the 2018 Farm Bill. So although the act itself has been signed into law, the regulations that will spell out how it will be implemented don't exist yet. So really what is in place at the moment in terms of regulations is the 2014 Farm Bill, which created pilot programs for the cultivation of industrial hemp. So this becomes a significant issue for supply chains when you are looking at CBD products. Does your supplier have 2014 Farm Bill compliant hemp? Was the hemp cultivated under one of the 2014 Farm Bill pilot programs? There are a number of those programs in existence, and there is 2014 Farm Bill hemp on the market, but there has also been a rapid influx of hemp that was not grown under one of the 2014 pilot programs since the 2018 Farm Bill was signed. We still have a little ways to go here, and in the meantime, it does appear that there is some enforcement discretion being applied, but we are still waiting, still watching for the regulations that will implement the 2018 Farm Bill and the new version that deschedules hemp and hemp seeds. Courtney?
All right, so next, we keep seeing in the news that doctors are just not seeing drug and device sales reps as much. So I think there are several reasons for this. Perhaps principal among them is the prevalence of information available online. In one recent report, about 50% of doctors surveyed said they never have a question for a rep they couldn't find the answer to themselves online. So I think, as I'll talk about in a second, I think companies need to maybe reconcile themselves to that fact. Another factor is probably the Physician Payment Sunshine Act. This is also Section 6002 of the Affordable Care Act. So this just says that medical product manufacturers have to disclose to CMS, Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services, any payments or other transfers of value made to physicians. So I think doctors, practices, and manufacturers are being very cautious about their compliance with this act, and that may also account for the decline in interaction. But what does this decrease mean for drug and device companies, which is, what the aim of this webinar is to tell you? First, sales reps have to be trained and understand their value proposition to doctors. They also, from a liability standpoint, need to understand both their limitations under the Sunshine Act and their appropriate level of interaction with doctors, and even more importantly, appropriate amount of interaction with patients, which is 0. Also, I think, as I said, life sciences companies probably need to reconcile themselves to the fact that the web has become the doctor's most preferred source of information. And in doing so, they need to make sure that the information they're putting out on their websites is reliable and current, recognizing that that is going to be the doctor's principal source. They also should undertake periodic sweeps of the internet to see what other sources are saying about their products, and if appropriate, maybe make some efforts to address it. If, for example, their products are being sort of promoted for a use off-label, then it becomes incumbent upon product manufacturers to at least undertake some investigation or address it if then the off-label use becomes foreseeable, and then there are potential health concerns with that. So I think that's what sort of those headlines mean. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kate.
Okay. So this was yet another record-breaking year at FDA for drug approval, particularly with regard to generic approvals. This was a new record. There were 1,171 generics approved in fiscal year 2019, and the previous record in 2018 was 971. So this is really a boon for industry, and it was a top objective of Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA Commissioner. But what this does lead us to question is whether it may open up space for the plaintiff's bar to allege that perhaps generic reviews and generic safety is not meeting the same standard. Is FDA working too quickly? The same type of allegations that they might make with regard to 510K devices. Is it, the implication being that there is insufficient review of the product before it reaches the market in order to establish safety and efficacy, and therefore maybe it would be maybe preemption would not be an option for generic devices. So this remains to be seen. I think these types of headlines create space. I don't necessarily believe that it is a valid argument, but we are seeing more movement in the press toward the position of a potential plaintiff and away from industry. Courtney, over to you.
All right, so robotic surgery. So this might seem like an old headline because we've heard about robotic surgery for a long time. In fact, I think the Da Vinci robot is now, it's been almost 20 years since it was approved. So for a long time, there have been predictions of robotic surgery really revolutionizing surgical care and bringing in the era of telemedicine. In truth, it's been less widely adopted than the promise of it that was first touted. But in part, this has been because of latency problems and slower connections that have made long-distance surgeries basically impossible. So the big headline now is the advent of 5G technology and the 5G connection. So this might mean that the initial promise of robotics sort of bridging gaps and closing distances between skilled surgeons and patients may become a reality. So that's sort of exciting, and that's what this new advance might make some of these other technologies, particularly telemedicine technologies and robotic surgery, more viable. So that's pretty exciting. And back to you, Kate. I told you this was lightning speed.
So our last topic in the, oh no, I think we have one more after this, but this topic in the lightning round is vaping. This has been in the news a lot lately, and as of earlier this month, there were nearly 1,500 lung injury cases associated with e-cigarette or vaping products. They've been reported to the CDC from all over the United States, and there have been 33 deaths. All of the patients who have been involved have reported a history of using e-cigarette products or vaping products. And in the majority of the injuries, the patients are also reporting that they are using vaping products that contain THC, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana. There was a bit of a crackdown at FDA with regard to e-cigarette and vaping products. There are some manufacturers that are removing THC-containing vaping products until they are approved by FDA, and the likelihood of them being approved by FDA is fairly slim at this point. But it is a pretty significant change to see such warnings, particularly with regard to the addictive nature of nicotine, being so forcefully pushed by FDA when FDA first gained control of tobacco a number of years back. Their hands are really tied with regard to the amount of really health policy they could implement in the tobacco space. So this is a positive change to see, and hopefully their ability to do so will help a lot of the current users of these vaping products. A lot of them are younger people who are doing some real damage to their lungs, and it may, at this point, may be irreversible. Courtney, over to you.
All right, and truly our last and final topic in this lightning round and of this webinar, and this isn't particularly new, but I thought it'd be good to check in sort of almost a year in. So as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, Congress gave the FDA authority to establish a breakthrough device program. The FDA issued its final guidance on the program at the end of last year. The program provides a new sort of accelerated, a faster pathway for medical products that aim to improve on the safety of products currently on the market. So there are two criteria for inclusion in the breakthrough device program and sort of entry into this accelerated pathway. So the first is that the device has to provide for a more effective treatment or diagnosis of a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human disease or condition. And then secondly, it can be any one of the following. It could represent a breakthrough technology. There's no approved or cleared alternatives. This technology offers significant advantages over existing approved or cleared alternatives, or it can really demonstrate that its availability is in the best interest of patients. And if it meets those two criteria, then it's eligible for this sort of faster path, and it's really one that involves a lot of sort of back and forth with the FDA. So just checking in a year later, I think by January of this year, the FDA had already received 200 applications for breakthrough device status, and then throughout the year they have cleared devices under this program. Some sort of sexy devices have been approved through this pathway. I think most recently was a retinal imaging platform that uses artificial intelligence to analyze retinal images, which are used in the evaluation and diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So by most accounts, this program has been successful. And I think it looks like maybe there are a couple questions, but we'll head on into Q&A. Heather, did you want to tell people how to ask questions?
Yeah, so if you have a question, you can do so by using the Q&A panel located in the bottom right of your screen in the WebEx application. Just hit your, type in your question and hit the send button, and we will receive those questions.
Okay, it looks like I've got one here that's definitely for me. So what would it take for insurers to get on board with insuring cannabis products? So great question. I don't know that I definitely know the answer to it, but I can tell you, a couple factors that would make insurers more likely. And I do think I should say that is where the future is going. And I think it will be, a insurable interest at the federal level and in a short amount of time. So I think a guinea pig would be helpful. So one insurer that's willing to take on these products, one sort of larger commercial insurer, so that other carriers could kind of see what's happened. Are they facing, federal scrutiny? Are they running afoul of any laws, and how's that going for them? I think an influx of actuarial data from maybe the smaller boutique insurers that are covering these products already would be helpful. And then, of course, a federal pronouncement that, says marijuana is absolutely legal in every capacity would certainly also usher in this era of the willingness on part of commercial insurers. So I don't have a direct answer, but I think any of those factors would definitely accelerate where I think we're already headed, which is that these products will be insurable eventually. Kate, did you see any questions for you?
I do see one. The question is with regard to the International Medical Device Regulators Forum document that was just released earlier this month, and whether it would replace FDA's cybersecurity standards. And the answer to that is no. The draft that has been written is really more of broad principles and a framework that's intended to get the international stakeholders on the same page, but then each participant, each country that is participating in this really has to implement these broader principles in its own appropriate way. So they need to be reviewed by the regulatory authorities in each country and implemented as the country deems appropriate. It's really more of a policy standard than a set of regulations.
Okay.
And I'm not seeing any other questions. Courtney, you?
No, it doesn't look like anyone else. If there's anything that somebody has that we didn't get to or didn't see, please feel free to send it to us. We neglected to put our contact information on the screen, but it's Courtney Young at medmarc.com and Catherine Klaus at medmarc.com. And of course, you can also reach us just through contact us on the website, and that'll get routed to the right place. But thank you so much for having us, and I think we'll turn it back over to Heather.
All right. Well, thank you, Kate and Courtney, for presenting on these headlines. We are so anxiously awaiting what's going to arise in 2020 and what you guys will deem as the hot topics to present on. This concludes our webinar.